Welcome to my channel and my Death Row Dinners series. Tonight's dinner has been ordered on Just Eat and is coming from a local takeaway called Philly Steaks and Shakes. Once it arrives, I'll plate it up and then I'm going to tell you the story of Stephen Albert McCoy. My food has just arrived. So I have here a cheeseburger, which I'm going to take out the box and put on a plate. It is going to be messy to eat. French fries, which I'm going to put salt, vinegar and ketchup with. And a strawberry milkshake. And this is the last meal that Stephen Albert McCoy had. Although it didn't specify where he got it from. I could have got it from McDonald's, but their cheeseburger just looks so sad. And if it's your last meal, you want it to be a good one. Trusty bit of kitchen roll, because I think that this could get messy. You can see how stuffed that burger is. It is a cheeseburger, and it's obviously got other bits on there with it. Let's give the milkshake a taste first. It's so thick, I can't get it. It's really creamy and it's got a lovely strawberry taste. Compulsory chip check. So, Stephen Albert McCoy was born on the 17th of December 1948 to Frankie McCoy. I wasn't able to find out any information on his father, and there really wasn't a lot about his family situation or his childhood. But he was born in Harris in Texas, USA, and that's where he spent most of his life. It does appear that he didn't complete high school because his education level is equivalent to 7 years GED. And that's a group of tests. I think there's 4 tests that they use in America, or they used at that time anyway, to ascertain somebody's education level if they haven't completed high school or got their high school diploma. I don't actually know how I am going to bite into this because it's so big and my mouth is so small. This did not stop McCoy from being able to train and start working as an electrician. And in May of 1972, he got married to Gaynor Meredith Haley, who was 9 years younger than he was. And she also lived in Texas. There's not an awful lot of information about McCoy's life before the 3 crimes that really were key to landing him on death row. Oh, that's a mushroom. At some point, he became friendly with a man named James Emery Pastor, and the two of them began to get involved in burglary and theft. And it wasn't until the end of 1980 that McCoy became involved with murder. And that happened when he and Pastor met an acquaintance named Gary LeBlanc. Gary LeBlanc had a brother named Eddie. To avoid confusion, if I say LeBlanc, I mean Gary. And if I'm talking about his brother, I'll call him Eddie. I'm going to call everyone by their first names, except for the 3 convicts. And that's just to maybe make it a little bit easier for you guys to follow. and for me to keep track of exactly who is who. Now, LeBlanc's brother Eddie was involved with a woman named Trudy Howard. Trudy had previously been married to a man named Robert Edward Howard, and even though they were divorced, she was still the named beneficiary on his life insurance policy. And when Trudy and Eddie got together, they came to the conclusion that the best way to fund their life together would be to bump Robert off and claim on the insurance. Eddie happened to mention this plan or idea, because at that point it was just an idea, to his brother Gary. And of course, Gary knew two rather shady types in the form of Pastor and McCoy. So the three men, LeBlanc, Pastor and McCoy, together with Trudy and Eddie, concocted a plan where they would murder Robert, and the payment for committing this crime, the payment for ending the life of another human being, was going to be $1,000 and a motorbike. Now, I know we're talking 1980, and $1,000 had greater value than it does today, but still. The first plan was that McCoy would use his skill as an electrician to connect a spark wire to the petrol tank of Robert's vehicle. However, this did not work out. So they came up with another plan where Trudy would arrange to meet Robert in a local downtown nightclub. The club in question was Robert's place of work. I'm getting to the point when I'm going to have to take this stick out, and when I do, this is just going to fall to bits. I'm going to have to do a lot of editing because this is so messy. So this was October the 25th, 1980. And when the three men got to the club, LeBlanc went and slashed one of the tyres on Robert's truck. LeBlanc then returned to the vehicle where his two friends were waiting, and he handed Pastor a photo of Robert and a firearm. The three men sat and waited, and sure enough, Robert came out of the club and headed for his vehicle. And upon reaching it, it did not take him long to realise that there was a problem with one of the tyres. So he went round to the boot of his car, where he kept a jack and a spare tyre. And while he was engaged in looking for these items, Pastor snuck up behind him and shot him once through the head, and then the three men fled. This is an absolute mess. I am going to get a knife and fork to finish this burger. Pastor knew that as he was the one who actually pulled the trigger, he had the most to lose if the three men were caught. So in order to even up the field, Pastor persuaded LeBlanc and McCoy to swear a blood oath that they would both kill someone in front of the other two men, and that way they would all be equally guilty, and it would, in theory, ensure none of them would testify against the others. So McCoy was the first of the two to fulfill his part of the oath. So remember, it was the 25th of October that Robert Howard was killed. November, and I couldn't get the exact date, that this next murder occurred, so they weren't really letting much time elapse. And this time the victim was a 27-year-old woman named Diana Trevino Oliver. And the three men abducted her, forcing her to get into their truck. They drove her to a secluded field, and they took turns raping her. And then McCoy took a knife and he stabbed her. The next murder, and LeBlanc's turn to fulfill his part of the oath, came on the 1st of January 1981. The victim was only 18 years old. The three men had been out in Louisiana and they were driving home. They had some women with them, and on their way they passed a car that was stranded by the side of the road, and there was only one occupant, a single female. This was the driver, and her name was Cynthia Darlene Johnson. Cynthia had finished her shift in the cafeteria where she worked on New Year's Eve, and she had driven home, got changed and ready to go out and celebrate New Year's. She first went to a Houston lounge, and then at about 10 p.m, she went on to the Copa Club, which was located at Richmond and Kirby. She remained in this club celebrating New Year and was last seen leaving the club just after midnight with the intention of driving herself home. It was on her way home that her vehicle broke down and she was forced to stop at the side of the road. The three men dropped their companions home and then returned to Cynthia, who was still waiting with her 1979 Mustang just off the Gulf Freeway. They lured her into their car with the offer of helping her. And if you're an 18-year-old woman on New Year's Day, it's the small hours and you're stranded. And this was pre the days of mobile phones, and I really think poor Cynthia never stood a chance. Once she was in the vehicle, the men drove her to a warehouse which they used to store stolen goods, and they took her out of the car and into the warehouse. McCoy and Pastor then took turns raping her. LeBlanc was also meant to have his turn, but he was unable to. And the other two men laughed at him for this, as he later testified in court. Once they'd finished raping poor Cynthia, McCoy held her down, and LeBlanc and Pastor used an electrical cord to strangle her. Pastor then wanted to ensure she was dead. He took a hammer and a nail, and he used the hammer to drive the nail into her nose and into her brain. And that is, to me, that is just so brutal and unnecessary. Once this was done, the three men bundled Cynthia's body into the boot of their vehicle. The following day, the three men took McCoy's wife, Gaynor, in the car to run a few errands, and Gaynor actually remarked on the fact that the car seemed to be sitting much lower than normal, and Pastor joked that it was to do with the dead weight in the boot. Gaynor was then horrified when the men drove her to a field just off Castendale Road, and they went to the boot where they retrieved Cynthia's body and dumped it in the field. Gaynor was terrified of saying anything to anyone because she was in fear for her life and the lives of her children. And it was that fear that prompted her to keep silent about what she had seen. So, those three murders were committed. Life carried on for McCoy. It wasn't until 1983 when he was actually in jail for a burglary that he had been convicted of that Gaynor finally got the confidence up to call her brother and tell him what she had witnessed. At this time, Pastor was also in jail. He was in Alabama and McCoy was in Texas. And McCoy was serving a 5-year term. Gaynor's brother was in law enforcement. He worked as a Travis County Sheriff's detective. And once she had given him the information, he was able to pass it on to the relevant authorities so that they could actually investigate the crime. Now, it's only Cynthia that Gaynor knows about. She doesn't know about the other two. Because both Pastor and McCoy were currently in jail, the police decided they were going to approach LeBlanc first. And as soon as they did, he sang like a canary. He struck a deal with the authorities that in exchange for leniency, he would testify against Pastor and McCoy. He also agreed to be fitted with a wire, and he then was able to encourage his brother Eddie and Eddie's now wife Trudy to talk about the hit they arranged on Robert. And this was all caught on a recording. This all led to the three men, LeBlanc, Pastor and McCoy, standing trial for the murders of Robert Howard and Cynthia Johnson. McCoy actually insisted he was in another room when Cynthia was being killed. But the jury did not buy this, and they convicted him and sentenced him to death for the murder of Cynthia. Pastor was sentenced to death for the murder of Robert, and LeBlanc was given 35 years in prison. Sadly, none of the three men were convicted or charged for the murder of Diana Oliver. McCoy did later on confess to having committed this, but as he was already in jail and on death row, no formal trial was ever held. McCoy's legal team did try to appeal the death sentence. They cited McCoy's competence to stand trial. They cited objections to the jury selection. They cited ineffective legal assistance. And they also said there was a lack of evidence that McCoy continued to present any danger to the public, despite the fact he'd been involved in 3 murders. It was on Tuesday, May 24th, 1989, when he was 40 years old, that Stephen Albert McCoy was executed in Huntsville, Texas, by lethal injection. This took place at 12:25 a.m. and it's actually considered to be one of the botched executions, and it's quite horrific. As I've already said, McCoy's final meal was a cheeseburger, French fries, and a strawberry milkshake. He chose not to make a final statement. The lethal cocktail of drugs were administered far too quickly, and this caused him to breathe heavily and jerk from the bed which he was bound to. And one of the witnesses for the execution was so horrified by the sight that they fainted, apparently knocking another witness over in the process. And McCoy is currently buried in the Houston National Cemetery in Texas. So that is the story of the man whose final meal I have been eating, and what he did to end up on death row. I hope you have found this video informative. It somehow seems wrong to say I hope you've enjoyed it because of the subject matter. I couldn't find photos of Robert, Diana and Cynthia, and I really wanted to because I wanted to end the video with their faces. I hope that you will join me for the next video. Until then, Stay safe. Bye.